way to put what I'm doing here. I contextualized Harry Potter within certain trends in modern fiction. And specifically, if we go back and look at certain elements of modern fiction in terms of fantasy, and we'll also take up a little bit of sci-fi, um, there was a major uptick in fantasy writing, essentially following the Romantic movement in the 19th century. And then fantasy was revived as a genre very greatly by Tolkien in the 20th, and of course, the C.S. Lewis material that Carol's just been talking about. But a huge portion of these works never include any astrology in the setting, although historical accuracy would mandate it. So the question here is why? And this, again, is this use of medieval settings. Um, Good example of this situation is The Lord of the Rings. Um, Here you have a very medieval type of universe, if you will. No astrology in it. Basically, if you take The Lord of the Rings, I mean, one can do a lot more with it, but basically, it's what we might now call an action-adventure, to use film terminology. There's not very much character development at all, but there's a great deal of action. Now, there are components. There are things like the battle between good and evil. Tolkien even continues this battle outside of the immediate chronology of Frodo in the Ring and Bilbo in the Ring, and goes into it in some of his other variations on Middle-earth. But all of those talk about good and evil. What's missing is prophecy. What's missing is a sense of prediction. Choice is basically what propels action. There's no sense of fate. The closest you can come to the presentation of occult issues in The Lord of the Rings is Galadriel, and the ability of the elves to see. They could see some things, they could see some trends, but they were currents more than a prediction as we would think of it. Now, another component of looking at this is that, and this is where we kind of move over a little bit into the sci-fi area, is that a lot of the presentation of medieval fantasy should probably be understood as being futurism and not pastism, because there's there are a couple of ideas about what happens to humanity that are perhaps a little more explicit in the sci-fi genre. So either technology triumphs and we go out to the stars and we have Star Trek or Babylon 5 or whatever, or there's an environmental catastrophe that reduces us to a technological world equivalent to the Middle Ages, and that's where fantasy comes in very often. Now, you get some mixes of this where one alternate is what are called alternate universes, and there's several writers in this. The Dark-Haired Man is a good example of this as a recent one. You'll also see some of the works of Robert Charles Wilson in this area. And then you also have and here, what happened was a critical choice happened in history that wasn't what happened in our universe, and history goes elsewhere. For example, in one of Wilson's book, instead of mainline Christianity as we understand it, the Christianity that triumphs was Gnostic. And so you get a different world. The other idea is, and Anne McCaffrey has done this in two of her series, and you can sort of see this in Frank Herbert as well, individuals from technologically advanced culture decide that they want to live at a lower technological level. And a very good example of that is the McCaffrey Pern series, but also her Decision at Duna series. What happens with these is that we should probably call this nouveau medievalism, because apart from the technological issues, what's happening with these works is they're embedding a 20th century sensibility into a medieval technology or world. And so what they're really interested in is low-tech solutions. But the thing is, they're coming out of a 20th century view where astrology is just not part of their worldview. They're coming from more of a scientific point of view. And so these other areas of the occult, and frequently religion, don't even get considered. So, good example of this in the Anne McCaffrey series on Pern. Here you have a medieval agrarian culture that exists apart from religion, apart from esotericism, apart from mysticism. There's even not really any philosophy. Everything is craft-oriented. Now, the interest in the series, of course, is the dragons themselves, who are absolutely wonderful. But as it turns out, as you go through the series, the dragons actually happen to be a case of high-tech genetic engineering that happened by the humans before they went low-tech. And then you have a few little kind of cheats, like their lighting system, which they call glows, are actually a plant which just so happened to be on that planet. Now, another approach in fantasy work has been to consider magic. Magic is a huge issue in many fantasy novels. Good example there, Catherine Kurtz's Dare I series. But there are all sorts of variations on how magic is approaching these, and they result in a great deal of the dramatic tension, often between those who have talents and those who don't. But what happens there is that they're talking about magic, but no astrology for the most part, because these 20th century writers have, I think, largely forgotten, if they ever knew, that astrology was used by magicians in the Middle Ages, for example, to do electional astrology in order to do a ritual at a particular time. Those kinds of issues have dropped out. But magic itself is a very interesting and fun plot device, and it will interface a little bit with religion in some of these works as well, but generally not astrology. So, why magic but not astrology? Well, in one particular argument is magic is really wielded. It's the way it's treated in many of these works. I would almost call it a martial art, because it's exactly that sort of thing. It's a weapon. Now, this again fits very well with this concept of action adventure, which is so prevalent in modern fiction and in our modern reality. Astrology speaks to time, place, and fate. And what that suggests is that we can't just randomly go around the earth as heroes and heroines slaying the bad guys at any time. Astrology presupposes limits. This is not quite as sexy.